Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and this evening's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Good evening. Our guest tonight and next week is Mr. Peter James. He has often been described as living a James Bond style of life in a twilight world of technological spying. For 9 years, he served as an aerospace engineer for the Pratt & Whitney Aircraft Corporation and traveled to international scientific conferences in such cities as Athens, Madrid, Belgrade, Venice, and Paris. At these conferences, Mr. James would supposedly mingle with Soviet scientists and then covertly report his findings to a CIA contact. Mr. James has even identified his CIA contact as then chief of the CIA Miami field office, Justin F. Glickoff. Now retired, Mr. Glickoff warmly praised James for his services in a December the 18th, 1969 letter. It has been reported that Peter James also cooperated with the little-known and yet important United States Air Force Foreign Technology Division. James has charged that the FTD used threats and intimidation and played favorites with companies, scientists, and professors in the United States who cooperated with the Air Force Foreign Technology Division. Mr. James is also the author of 2 books, one entitled The Soviet Conquest from Space, written in 1974, and The Air Force Mafia, written in 1975. Both books received selection by the Conservative Book Club. Our topic this evening, and again next week, will be the CIA, the Air Force Foreign Technology Division, spying, and also some views that he has on the Soviet Union. Mr. James, welcome to our program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Joining with me in questioning our guests will be 3 members of the panel. First of all, from our regular panel staff is Mary Lou Reed, holding a baccalaureate from Mills College and did graduate work at Columbia University. Welcome, Lou.
Thank you, Tony.
It's a pleasure to welcome for the first time to our panel David Coyne, who's a member of the faculty at North Idaho College teaching in the field of sociology. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Tony.
And it's a pleasure to welcome back again to our program Mr. Doug Clark, the managing editor of the Coeur d'Alene Press. Welcome, Doug. We'll proceed to questions at once in the first series from Mary Lou Reed.
Well, Mr. James, you started as a rocket engineer for the Pratt & Whitney Corporation, and then you were recruited by the CIA. Now, just how did this come about? How did they find out about you, and how did they entice you to go to work for them?
Usually it works where they come to you rather than the other way around. I was representing Pratt & Whitney Aircraft at an international space conference in Athens, Greece. Many Russian scientists were there, engineers. I had a chance to meet them, and when I returned to Pratt & Whitney, I found out that in the corporate security office, Mr. Glickoff, then chief of the CIA field office in Miami, wanted to talk with me. They had apparently learned that I was making inroads with the members of the Soviet delegation, and his basic thrust was that the CIA did need the help of someone with my background, science, technology, physics, rocket engineering, and specifically somebody who was dealing with the Russians, their cream of the crop. And yes, we did have our spies in Moscow, but it's just a matter of the elements, and the timing was just perfect for me to get involved. Now, this was the period of James Bond, the Sean Connery films, and being 25 years old, I jumped in with both feet.
You didn't even have to think it over? You just
didn't
said,
even
yes,
have to think it
to.
over.
Well, we understand you have some slides about some of those days. Would you like to comment upon them now?
What I've done is I've brought a slide selection covering about 10 years of my activities. That's the Herod Atticus Theater in the Acropolis, King Constantine of Greece addressing a throng of East and West European scientists. That's the general format where the agents of both countries usually get together at scientific conferences. That's my wife, Diane, getting the autograph of Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov. Leonov was the first man to walk in space. And being a young couple at that time, it was a great thrill just to meet a Russian cosmonaut and talk with some of the Russians. And many of the scientists who would go overseas would normally combine their vacations with these scientific conferences. In this case, that's the Grand Canal in Venice. That's something that the Jameses did. You can think of the Jameses as combining a little espionage with their vacations just to spice up the vacation. One of the CIA requests was always to return with head and shoulders photos of the Russians that we would meet. Well, the Russians took a liking to my wife. So I didn't have to photograph them from behind flower pots. And as you can see, there they are lined up with Diane, part of the Grand Canal in the background. And these head and shoulders photos are critical for our own CIA-type dossiers. One of the most influential Russian cryptic political personalities we ever met is the gentleman on the right. That's Professor Georgy Zhivatovsky, who at the time was the assistant to the deputy premier of the Soviet Union. He showed a great interest in us, and later on he actually invited me to Moscow, but the CIA later turned thumbs down on that trip. If Americans would like to go overseas and possibly meet a tremendous number of espionage agents in one place, I recommend that you all go to the Paris Air Show held at Le Bourget Field every other year. It's been held this year during May and June. And if you want to know who the agents are, look for a cloudy day, and for the gentleman wearing the sunglasses, they're the agents. I'd like to introduce you to two important men. That's Professor Zhivatovsky again on the left, the assistant to the deputy premier. He's talking to the father of the Sputnik, academician Leonid Sadov on the right of the Academy of Sciences. Getting back to one of the CIA requests, you remember the head and shoulders photos that they wanted? Well, this was Professor Yuri Hodarev, deputy director of the Soviet Institute of Space Research, wanted to have himself photographed with my wife in that carriage. And thinking of the CIA request, this was ideal. And I noticed that after I took that particular shot, half of the Russian delegation was behind me. I thought I had a problem. I asked one of the Russians, is there a problem? And he said, oh, no, there's no problem, except we'd like to get into the carriage with Diane, too. So we go on to the next slide. And suddenly you see that one by one the Russians began to pile into that carriage, and I got about 95% of their delegation in Mar del Plata, Argentina, in that carriage. The next slide would also show you that she enjoyed this as well. And the last fellow to get into the carriage shown there, Igor Prisovok, happened to be the assistant to the Zhivatovsky, who was trying to entice me to go to Moscow. And he was building up their dossiers on the Jameses, where we were born and where I worked and where my parents were born. And remember, both sides can play the same game. This is a shot that I took in the Buenos Aires airport. After the Mar del Plata conference, a number of the Russians photographed us as we deplaned from our flight. And while I reciprocated the favor, by the time I got in the terminal building, photographed 3 Russians who photographed us, and also 3 Russians who met the Russians who photographed us. And basically I turned those into the CIA so they could run a check as to who these characters were. This is a typical example of what a real intelligence report looks like. That's actually my data given to the CIA from the Mar del Plata conference. And generally speaking, if you were working for the CIA, you'd receive thousands of pages that would look similar to that, say in the rocket field. This is an example of where the head and shoulders photos are used. You match up the names with the head and shoulders photos, tie that in with the technical data that you do learn. And this is important because we found out, especially during the 1960s, the Russians were using pseudonyms for their scientists. So we had to match the head and shoulders with the actual names. This is an example of where the real intelligence is acquired at conferences. It's not where somebody reads an official paper before a forum. It's at a cocktail party. 2 people have drinks in their hands, and you isolate their scientist from their own intelligence service, and you try to learn something from them. When I informed the Russians I was not going to Moscow, an interesting incident happened. The gentleman in the center handed me an envelope to read. It was written in German. I couldn't read it. I handed it back to him, and this Russian then carefully put it in his inside pocket. And the Soviet intelligence, their KGB, had gotten my own fingerprints, again running a check as to who this character was. His friend that was on the left of that photo is shown here the following morning in the white shirt, photographing Peter James. After he took about 4 or 5 shots of me, I decided to pick my camera up and photograph Mr. Ryazantsev. And these are examples of the fun and games that are being played at these meetings as well. This is a typical example of some of the documents I began to collect when I realized that we had problems within our own intelligence services. On the left is a document where the Air Force intelligence was trying to get an engineer replaced in his job assignment because he dared to challenge their intelligence assessments. On the right is just a memo sent to me at my home trying to get me to spy for Air Force intelligence. This was done without the knowledge of corporate headquarters or the security department, and it really showed how Air Force intelligence was infiltrating colleges, universities, and private industry. I was fired on October 4th of 1971 from Pratt & Whitney Aircraft primarily because I wouldn't keep my mouth shut. I decided that even though I was acting in the national security interest of the United States, spying on the Russians, we had an internal security problem involving our own intelligence services, and my efforts to expose this actually cost me my job with Pratt & Whitney, and all I had to show for it were my paychecks, badge, and tie clasps. When I tried to get my story out, I contacted the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee at the time, Congressman A. Baer. He got a hold of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and I prepared a 29-page statement under oath laying out my allegations against Air Force intelligence. And then I decided to write a 5-part copyright series for the Palm Beach Post. This is what it looked like. That was a Sunday morning. The next slide would show you a typical example of the coverage that we received. It was substantial. The next slide, the last part of this series, which amounted to about 13 pages, also shows that I was going after President Nixon. The headline of that one particular shot is the Houston plan was not rescinded, as the White House claimed. And I decided that President Nixon was actually at the root of most of the problems, and I decided to take him on while he was still president. And of course, he was in trouble with Watergate during that time period. Washington Post got into the act along with Senator William Proxmire, who conducted his own investigation of my allegations, and Senator Proxmire wanted to abolish the Foreign Technology Division. And the next slide indicates that the press coverage that we did have, Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger did curtail some of their activities, and I was pleased with that because it took several years, but I was more or less vindicated with the allegations that I was making. Tried to get my views out by writing several books, Soviet Conquest from Space, which I outlined the Russian military threat, and the Air Force Mafia, and I recommend to my listening audience, don't bother to pay for it, go to your library and save yourself a few dollars. And I noticed that, this is the last slide, many people in our country try to get their views out as well, other agents, other people, and the basic name of the game is trying to protect the public's right to know. And throughout this entire experience, I've had a great appreciation for our Constitution and for what we do call a free press, because without a free press and media, I was really in trouble.
So what started as fun and games really ended up on a pretty serious
What started
note.
as fun and games, actually, the CIA described it as a very bizarre story at the end, because though I've condensed the story, we also had a situation where in Brussels, Belgium, American agents actually threatened me and my wife. We had a chase through Europe. I managed to get back to the United States, filed complaints with the CIA and the FBI, but by the time I returned to Florida, I lost my job.
And you were never paid by the CIA?
I never accepted money. I was offered money by Air Force Intelligence. I turned that down as well. As you know, when Uncle Sam gives you money, there are strings attached. I really enjoy my independence. And as it turned out, it was a stroke of luck because this also meant I did not have to sign what's known as a secrecy oath, which means I can talk about my experiences here, about my experiences with my intelligence notes, without violating national security. Had I signed that oath, the Supreme Court has upheld the fact that these agencies could censor my material.
David Coyne.
I'd like to pursue the idea of this secrecy oath. Frank Snepp wrote a book called, I think, Decent Interval.
Yes.
Depicted the last days of the Vietnam War, and much of his information was considered to be top secret by the CIA. Stansfield Turner felt that he violated the public trust and put the clamps on him in terms of writing further information, and stripped him, I think, of all profits from his book. Do you believe that Frank Snepp or yourself violated the public trust as Stansfield Turner has accused?
That's a difficult question. It really is yes, no, but let me be specific. Frank Snepp, in my opinion, was trying to protect the public's interest by letting the public know what really happened. And it's rather unfortunate, but not only in our spy establishment, but throughout our Defense Department, we have documents that are classified secret, allegedly in the name of national security. As it turns out, this is a procedure sometimes used to cover up politically embarrassing situations for our government. Just as the Pentagon Papers. They basically showed, according to Daniel Ellsberg, that our government was lying to the American people about our involvement in Vietnam, yet they tried to nail him to the wall. My position is this. It is a judgment decision that each individual must make within the laws of our government. And the laws are set up where you can test your case in court. And I think in Frank Snepp's case, I do believe if you sign a secrecy oath, you are bound by it. But I also believe if you're willing to take the risk of blowing something open because you personally feel it's politically embarrassing data, I think you have the right to go through with it and test it in a court of law.
Doug Clark.
Well, then what, talking about all this, and there's been a lot of anti-CIA in the media and personal opinions, what should the role be of America's CIA? Should it be eliminated?
No, by no means, because we do need, in my opinion, a strong military-industrial complex and a strong intelligence service that serves what I call our legitimate national security interest. We do need that. We can't afford to have another Pearl Harbor in the technological field. And that is really the primary function of our intelligence services. Now, we do not need an intelligence service that is infringing upon the rights of Americans like we've found out, whether it involved mail openings, burglaries, invasion of privacy. That, they went far beyond the law, and our government should have really come down on them, but I guess it's hard for our government to come down on itself. That's half of the problem we face. But we do have a role for the CIA, but my position is that their actions must really coincide with the national interest and the public's interest, rather than the interest of a few misguided individuals or multinational corporations or other groups. But we definitely need an intelligence service.
All right, now how do you get a balance there? Because on one hand, you've got to have secrecy for the national security, yet on the other hand, you've got to expose the corruption.
Okay. Well, the balance is defined quite simply. Having worked in the Defense Department area, there are legitimate secrets. The public doesn't have to know about chamber pressures, rocket chamber pressures, expansion ratios. That doesn't mean anything. Those are legitimate secrets. Now, in the area of political corruption, it is really very easy to look at a document and realize it's been classified because of political reasons. And from that standpoint, then someone's going to make a judgment decision which will violate the law by releasing the information publicly. I am in favor of that, but it is a judgment decision. And obviously judgment decisions mean someone could make a mistake, at which point you'd have to pay the price. But the point is, if you don't have that safety valve of allowing someone to go to the press, then we're really in bad trouble, because in our democracy, I personally feel that the public has a right to know what's going on, because the public really should determine the course that our government takes.
I'd like to follow up on Doug's question. We heard during the United States Senate hearings concerning the CIA some very disturbing facts, such as that the CIA agents had met with organized crime in this country in plotting and interference with Cuba and Castro. We also heard that LSD had been given to some individuals, and one individual had supposedly died from jumping out a window, and 20 years later we find out the truth. They denied. Do you agree with those charges in the U.S. Senate, that those type of activities domestically have taken place by the CIA, an organization that was created by law to deal with foreign countries and matters rather than domestically?
I'm convinced, based on the intelligence hearings that were headed by Senator Frank Church, that yes, these occurrences did happen. There was definitely a CIA mafia relationship in attempting to kill Fidel Castro. There's definitely also a FBI mafia relationship as well. I am intrigued by the fact that our government refuses to investigate itself, which means that there's been enough infiltration by organized crime within our government that our government will not do a satisfactory job of getting all this information out. And for that reason, it takes 5, 10, 20 years for the public to find out. And that's one of the reasons why I'm heading in the direction of creating a center to expose governmental corruption, which is independent of the press, independent of the government, which will try to tackle problems like this. Because personally, I'm concerned, I know there's a cover-up concerning the Kennedy assassination. I'm already on record from 3-4 years ago. I feel personally it was a CIA mafia operation.
So some of these things that you are concerned about and you've organized on that behalf, you don't think the CIA has completely been corrected from the reports that have come out through congressional hearings?
No, you'll find out when you work inside. These agencies, for legitimate reasons, have to be compartmentalized. Many of their operations are secret, and very few people know about that. And the conditions they work under allow them to continue to do these activities. Even during the Senate Watergate hearings, when Senator Sam Ervin was going strong, we have instances where there were some burglaries around the United States. Now, you would naturally assume that these burglaries would cease while they were being investigated. But this is not the case.
But Reed.
I'd like to ask you to return to your criticism of the Air Force Technical Division, what you call the Air Force Mafia, and you have alluded to the fact that perhaps their budget has been cut. But what did they do, and what are they doing now?
Okay, now to my knowledge, this is an area, again, now where I am operating outside these secret doors. I can only go on what the Associated Press article, which said that according to their information, Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger curtailed some of their activities. But there's no way I can get behind those secret doors to find out whether, in fact, this has happened. Personally, I feel it hasn't happened.
But their activities before were basically to try and find technical information from the Soviet Union and give it to our aerospace companies. Is that correct?
Well, their activities get very gray. Most people thought the Foreign Technology Division was in the business of simply evaluating foreign data. When I got into that building 828, their headquarters, we found out that they had spies all over the place, operating, infiltrating private industry, colleges, universities, operating overseas. And the beauty of this was the Foreign Technology Division, which is a branch of the Air Force Systems Command, was not even accountable to the United States Intelligence Board at the time, which oversees intelligence operations. When Senator Proxmire got into this act, there were many congressmen and senators did not even know that this was a spy operation.
And was it just spying, or was there actually a stealing of information that was going on?
Well,
is there not an ethical difference between gathering and assessing and actually transmitting technical information?
Well, there was a lot of stealing of information going on, and if you want to get very critical about it, we even believe that the Foreign Technology Division was involved in industrial espionage. In Pratt & Whitney Aircraft's case, there were several managers who were on their payroll or received money from the Foreign Technology Division, and the word we have was this was without the knowledge of corporate headquarters or the security office. And one of those managers began to send to the Air Force agents company proprietary data. These are company secrets. And to the agent who was receiving it, he was very friendly with General Electric, Pratt & Whitney's #1 competitor. The implication was that this spy organization within the Air Force was not only involved in analyzing intelligence and maybe even collecting it, but they were in a position of trying to influence the decision-making process by making deals with various aerospace contractors. And what upset Senator Proxmire was this allowed the Foreign Technology Division to dole out their intelligence reports to those contractors which played ball with them. Well, you see, under a free enterprise system, that really doesn't wash, because if you have 3 or 4 people competing or contractors competing, they should have the equal opportunity to compete. And the cards are stacked in advance.
David Coyne.
Well, you mentioned the term accountability. How can the public be assured that the CIA is doing what it's supposed to do? I know it's an arm of the executive branch, but where's the accountability for the CIA?
Well, according to the latest guidelines, they're supposed to be more stringent than, say, prior to Watergate, because allegedly the president has more control over this than his national security advisor. Personally, I don't think that's adequate. Personally, I feel that if these current guidelines existed under President Nixon, we'd have even more problems, giving him even more power. We do have Senate select committees or intelligence committees overseeing their operations. That's a step in the right direction. But if you really want to get down to the basics, you've got to have people with strong ethics working inside. That's where the accountability is.
Would you say that the CIA represents a power elite in America that is basically uncontrollable?
I wouldn't say they're uncontrollable, because as long as you have people like Frank Snepp and others willing to blow the whistle on them, there's some sort of control. The only problem is there's a time lag between what happens and when we find out. What we really lack in our country is a decision on whether a country should be involved in the area of covert operations, which has been the #1 arrow aimed at the CIA. And I feel that Senator Frank Church's intelligence hearings were the ideal vehicle to pursue this, and the CIA very adeptly manipulated these hearings and turned it into a joke where they're holding poison dart guns, etc., before the public, rather than debating a key issue: should our government be involved in covert operations? And that was never resolved, so that situation currently exists.
May I clear up a point in my own mind? I get from your conversations this evening that you are saying that what we're trying to do is simply to say that the CIA and other agencies of that type are to confine themselves to what the law allows them to do, certain legitimate collection of data and information, but to stay out of other areas that in fact, do not even allow them to act in that way under the prescribed law.
You're correct. It's very important that these agencies and branches of our government operate within the law. When I wrote the Air Force Mafia, I noticed that the UPI, one section of that book they jumped on was a dialogue I had with an Air Force agent. And this Air Force agent was explaining that because they were spies, they were allowed to operate outside the law. And I was explaining to this agent that you're still living in our country and there are laws that you must abide by. And they said, well, laws in this business don't mean anything. In a democracy, they do.
Doug Clark.
Going into the spying operations, how much danger is there involved in these spying operations? At one time in Marseille, you were warned by a Russian that you were being followed by agents. Another time you were pressured not to publish your book. There was a mention made that there could be automobile accidents arranged. How serious is this?
Well, it's very serious when you realize that the government still has the machinery to intimidate any American it wishes. Those Americans, whether they're liberals or conservatives, who basically disagree with the government. And I learned the hard way in Brussels, Belgium, when I was working on my book, where we were threatened with an automobile accident by certain American agents. And they made it clear to me, and this has been confirmed by the recent intelligence hearings, that the intelligence services could operate outside the law, and there was an arrangement made with our own Justice Department to look the other way.
Now, do you mean by intimidation, you mean executions, murders?
Yes, I was told the story, in fact, in Building 828, where Air Force Intelligence allegedly has a hit squad, executive action or assassination squad. And one of the stories related to the fact where an American was to be hit overseas. He was drugged, beaten, thrown on a German Autobahn, and the American got away. And members of the hit squad were reprimanded with a comment, "What's the matter? Can't you guys even kill a guy right?" This was a story I was told by an Air Force agent in Building 828, a year before the threat came before my own doorsteps. So it is a dangerous business if you're trying to rock the boat.
With that, I have to interrupt. I'm sorry to say we're out of time. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed our program, and I promise you we're going to be coming next week at the same time to again discuss with Mr. Peter James this rather extraordinary and fascinating subject. Next week, in particular, we'd like to talk about the leaks from the CIA and other agencies, particularly the Paisley case. We also want to talk about the Soviet Union and United States detente and the SALT talks and the past agreement. Mr. James has some rather strong feelings on those subjects. I hope you'll be with us at that time at 6 o'clock. Until then, this is Tony Stewart wishing you a good week.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time. Campus of North Idaho College and this evening's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Our returning guest tonight for part 2 of our two-part series is Mr. Peter James. He has often been described as living a James Bond style of life in a twilight world of technological spying. For 9 years, he served as an aerospace engineer for the Pratt & Whitney Aircraft Corporation and traveled to international scientific conferences in many places in the world, including Athens, Madrid, Belgrade, Venice, and Paris. At these conferences, James would supposedly mingle with Soviet scientists and then covertly report his findings to a CIA contact. Mr. James identified his CIA contact as then chief of the CIA Miami field office, Justin Glickoff. Now retired, Glickoff warmly praised James for his services in a December the 18th, 1969 letter. It has been reported that Peter James also cooperated with the little-known and publicized United States Air Force Foreign Technology Division. James has charged the FTD of using threats and intimidation and playing favorites with American companies, scientists, and professors who cooperated with the Air Force undertakings. Mr. James is the author of 2 books that are best known. One of them is entitled Soviet Conquest from Space, 1974, and The Air Force Mafia, 1975. Both books received selection by the Conservative Book Club. We would like to continue our discussion this evening of the CIA, spying, and the question of foreign policy. We'll commence the questioning this evening with Mary Lou Reed.
Mr. James, I'd like to ask you to comment on the uses and misuses of secrecy, both here and abroad, in espionage. Do you think that it is overplayed? We hear that 99% of the classified material doesn't need to be classified. Is this used as a cloak?
Okay, let me answer you this way. Number one, we do have legitimate secrets that must be kept. And I would say, based on my experience within the aerospace field, that at least 30 or 40% of the data is overclassified. That can be released. When you move outside the Defense Department into other government agencies, I would say the figure is probably up to 60, 70, 80% that's overclassified, primarily because of political reasons. Now, we have a problem because in the area of technology, there are legitimate secrets that you must keep. The greatest fear, and why we really have a spy agency, is that of a technological breakthrough another country may undertake, like ours was the atomic bomb during World War II. So for that reason, the secrets that we have are legitimate, especially in the area of laser technology, things that are opening up new areas of investigations by our own government. They've got to be kept secret. But on the same token, as we mentioned in the previous program, politically embarrassing information. That's primarily the motive for classifying information for many bureaucrats. That's the area we've got to get into.
Do you think when CIA agents operate overseas that they actually are secret, their activities are secret, or do the people there know about them, and is there kind of an international directory of agents?
There probably is an international directory to a large extent. It's really possible to know who an agent is almost by the way they conduct their business. When you're in the business, thieves know thieves, agents know agents. The other factor is many agents overseas, believe it or not, are doing ordinary things that ordinary Americans would do, though they're categorized as agents, like going into libraries, doing research work, because some of the most important information our government receives about activities overseas is already on the shelf. In other words, it's open to their public. But the key is to organize it. And I would say that 90% of the intelligence that is received is already out on the shelf. And that's why we have a central intelligence agency.
And you'd say that is valid espionage, too?
That's valid. The Russians, in fact, do a better job at that than we do, but primarily because we have an open society and they can get away with it easier.
In addition to our regular panelists, Mary Lou Reed, joining us this evening is also Mr. David Cohen, who is a member of the faculty at North Idaho College in the field of sociology. Mr. Cohen will ask the next series of questions.
Yes, I'd like to ask you a question about American-Soviet détente. You've been very critical of American-Soviet détente, particularly as it relates to the SALT II treaty. And there seems to be an argument that's developed regarding the strategic capabilities of a Soviet bomber called the backfire bomber. The Soviet Union believes that it should not be included in the SALT II treaty because it's a medium-range bomber. It's really not a threat to the United States security. The United States believes that it's more than a medium-range bomber. It is a threat to United States security. Since you are a part of Air Force technology, could you enlighten this panel?
Well, I'm certainly glad that I expressed my views as early as 1974 about the SALT I agreement, because during that time period, the basic thrust of my argument was that the Russians are involved in a massive military arms buildup. And 3 or 4 years later, we find out this was the truth. In 1974, that's just a few years after we reached SALT I agreements with the Soviet Union, our defense budget was roughly $70 billion a year. Now, allegedly, we had a halt to the arms race. Today's defense budget is approaching $130 billion a year. And I think the American taxpayer has a right to ask, now wait a minute, I thought we were going to put a halt to the arms race. We've almost doubled our defense budget. The fact is, under detente, under these trade agreements like the wheat deal, technological assistance, computer trades, building trucks for the Russians, the American taxpayer indirectly is subsidizing the Soviet military-industrial complex. We're taking care of part of their economy for them. They can continue to reorder their priorities in the military sector, which forces the United States to build up or beef up our own defense establishment. So in effect, and this is now borne out, the Russians are involved in massive programs, generations of new ICBMs. If you look at what they had back at SALT I, they had an SS-9 missile, which could deliver a 25 megaton warhead. That's roughly 1,250 times as powerful as a Hiroshima bomb. Now they have an SS-18 missile, twice as powerful as their SS-9, and they're just building and building and building. There's no question about that. Now, our SALT negotiators, as far as I'm concerned, are mistaken when they deal with the Russians on what we can include in SALT II and what we can't. Backfire should be included. But what is not included is also the Soviet mobile missiles. That's going to be left out as well. And I think the American taxpayer should really know, and people concerned about our national security, that the Soviet negotiating philosophy is very simple. What's mine is mine, what's yours is negotiable. Simple as that.
Our third panelist this evening, and I'm happy to welcome him to our program, and he's been here before, is Doug Clark, the managing editor of the Coeur d'Alene Press. He will ask the next series of questions.
William F. Buckley, years ago in a Playboy interview, called Détente one of the great con games that has ever been foisted upon the American public. The American concept of nuclear war is basically that it's unthinkable. Now, do the Russians have that same concept?
That's an excellent question. I wish you'd had the opportunity to read some of the documents I read concerning Soviet military strategy. They had a Marshal, Sokolovsky would be the equivalent of the Minister of Defense. And he wrote a book called Military Strategy, which was really circulated within the Soviet Union. Basic thrust of Soviet political military strategy is that nuclear war is possible. In fact, the Russians do believe they can win a nuclear war. Simple as that. Americans during the Eisenhower administration were always thought in terms of if there's a nuclear war, all mankind would be annihilated. Well, the truth of the matter is our Defense Department has already reached the stage where about 4 years ago we announced the retargeting of our own missiles. Instead of aiming them at Soviet population and industrial sites, they're aimed at Soviet military sites, missile silos. And this is in recognition of the fact that there could be a nuclear exchange, according to our theory, that can be contained. This is very dangerous because when you relate to the Soviet military strategy, they believe they can not only win a nuclear war, but they can win it quickly. And they feel that because you've advanced in your technology, the basic thrust of their ideology, where war is a tool of politics, that doesn't change because you've built nuclear weapons. So these are things to think about.
Do you think Americans have been guilty of putting war on a metaphysical plane, philosophizing about it, and where all it basically boils down to is brute strength against strength?
I go along with that, and I would really place the blame on our own government, because our government has manipulated public opinion in that area. Our government has not brought the public on board with what our government is really thinking. And this is one reason why, by the way, Barzal Tarana, the Director of Civil Defense, has announced this massive new civil defense program in recognition of the Soviet efforts in that area as well.
This has also happened in China, I believe.
The Chinese are pretty good at that.
Yeah. Mr. James, in some of your literature and your speeches, and also the national media has been doing this, and other people, indicating that there's some very serious leaks within some of our agencies from within, not from the media without and so forth. The CIA is one of those. And a case that's brought this to our attention more clearly recently is the John Paisley case, where he was found dead some weeks ago in Washington, D.C., and he had with him, I believe, at the time of his death, a 9mm pistol. But according to some investigations, he was shot in the head with a larger weapon than that. Yet he was classified after the autopsy as being a suicide case from his own gun. But what makes this case important, I think, is the fact that it's alleged that certain very important secret documents from our government, the CIA, were found in his apartment and other places. There's been a really quite hush-hush about this case. With this and what you're saying and other things, and you said on our first program this also, are there serious leaks, and can you explain this in more detail?
We do have serious leaks in our government, and I believe probably within the next 5 years we're going to find this mole that we've been hearing about, where there's probably a Russian KGB agent. This is Soviet intelligence, the Committee for State Security, probably operating within our government. I find it hard to believe that the Russians have been very successful in penetrating British intelligence, French government, German government, yet they have not been able to penetrate the American government, and it's very easy to do so. The first several chapters of my first book, Soviet Conquest from Space, cover the problems we have with security. And I gave a series of examples where if the American public really knew how easy it is to get secrets out of facilities, you'd probably turn over in your grave if you're dead, and you'd really be shocked if you're paying the taxes to protect these documents. I feel that there's a serious security problem, and the other side of the coin is because of Watergate, we have compounded it because these intelligence agencies are really afraid to operate in that area to the degree they were in the past.
Some of this also can be done by technology, cannot it? It's not all done with personnel going in and breaking into buildings and so forth.
Right.
I was reading a story in Newsweek in June 1978, which was rather humorous in this particular case, where our embassy in the Soviet Union, through modern technology, was monitoring conversations in the Kremlin between Brezhnev and Prigozhin, and they were discussing an insignificant subject as far as national security is concerned. It was a massage parlor, and they were talking about Brezhnev was that Olga was great at this particular profession. So two things, I guess. One is that some of the information can be gathered through sophisticated equipment, both by we and the Soviets, and secondly, that all the information gathered is not significant.
That is correct. There are two areas of intelligence to think about. The sophisticated satellites, electronic surveillance. By and large, the majority of the intelligence budget goes in that area because that is a reliable way of confirming data. Now, the human intelligence, this is something President Carter recently has demanded we have more of, is an area of probing the minds of people who have access to the hardware that we've discovered. You've got to combine the two. One problem we have with the intelligence community is we can develop a capability based on hardware a nation has, but we still don't know whether the nation intends to use it or how they intend to use it. And that depends on what is going on in the minds of the leaders that have access to the data.
Lou Reed.
Well, what about the problem of erroneous information or bad recommendations? We have in recent history examples where the CIA recommended Bay of Pigs incorrectly, and Vietnam, evidently, they were not really quite that sharp either on the quality of their data. How do you account for this question of quality, or do you think there is some double agentry that goes on?
The quality of the intelligence is something that bothered me within Pratt & Whitney aircraft. We found out that Air Force intelligence had developed a scheme to prepare fraudulent intelligence information. Basically, that's being used to manipulate policymakers, decision makers within the Defense Department who spend the money. Intelligence is used to justify building certain weapons. And we found out that the quality was adversely affected because we had some agents who were intentionally preparing intelligence reports called raw data from the field that were totally wrong. And they were doing that for a number of reasons, some being their own job security. If you have agents who are being paid overseas to do a job, if they fail to make contact, obviously they have no information. To protect their job, they begin to fabricate data. And before you know it, our intelligence files are just loaded with what we call technical garbage.
You never, in the field of espionage, get very far away from the whole question of ethics, do you?
Exactly.
And do you feel that spying and espionage and the whole business is inherently corrupting? Is this something that actually draws the worst out of people?
I think there's a half and half. You got some truth to that. There are many reasons why people spy. Some are because of money, some for patriotic reasons. Some people love the action. Unfortunately, our spy agencies have gotten into the business of having dealings with the mafia and with their organized crime and people that can do unethical things. And when you get into that type of business, it is corrupting. But I do believe that most of our problems, and even in Iran, for example, is our government has been involved in supporting policies which really run against our traditional American grain. And as long as the American public can put the pressure on the government to demand this is the direction we want to go, and if we have a dictatorship that does not support the human rights, I don't think we should necessarily endorse it.
David Coyne.
Well, I'd like to pursue that question somewhat in a contemporary vein, relating the CIA misreading the events in Iran, as an example.
Sure.
What was the problem of the quality of information? Was it just misreading? Was it the president's fault? Was it the CIA's fault?
I can only put this together based on what I've heard the president say and what CIA Director Stansfield Turner has said. My evaluation of the whole situation is that the CIA, along with our other intelligence services, have a problem where a finished intelligence report is prepared, and the reader of that report basically gets to see the conclusion, but they do not get to see the raw data or the objective data used to reach that conclusion. So as a result, people are never in a position to challenge the author of these assessments. And I think President Carter hit the nail on the head, and I'm really happy to say that I authored a report in 1970 that went to the executive office of the president, 800 pages long. Should have been only 30 pages. Those 30 pages were my conclusions. 770 pages were objective summaries of the data that I used. And I just recently heard that President Carter would like to have it set up where he has an idea of what type of information was used to draw conclusions. That's the basic problem we now have within our whole intelligence network, is that we do not have the ability to go back to the original sources and check it out.
Okay, do you believe that, say, the CIA's relationship to SAVAK, which is the Iranian Secret Service, or equivalent to the CIA, had a lot to do with the United States misreading events in Iran?
Not having first-hand information, I can speculate. I would say that there was probably a relationship. Agents stick together, they have friends, and sometimes they don't even want to embarrass each other, and we pay the price because of that.
That part.
In your article entitled "A Systems Analysis of Détente," you described the Soviet Union as being one of the most repressive, totalitarian, adventuristic military powers of the world. Is this still the status quo, and why is it so hard for the American public to understand that?
I think it almost goes to the George Orwell novel of 1984, where the public is in a position of believing what our leaders say. And we've just had the recent example where suddenly the Chinese move into town, and now they're our friends, and the public now believes everything is okay in that area. What it boils down to is the PR job that the government does with the American people. And the PR job with the Soviet Union is, détente is good for us. Therefore, we should not talk about some of these embarrassing issues involving human rights, Soviet military buildup, until we pass the SALT II agreement through, so maybe President Carter can be reelected again. I'll tell you something a Russian agent once told me. This agent was the mastermind of the Christine Keeler-John Profumo sex scandal in Great Britain that ultimately led to the downfall of Macmillan's government, Prime Minister Macmillan. This agent told me in 1969 that our government negotiates seriously with the United States government only during election years. Something to think about.
Because of this gullibility then, and are we ripe for nuclear war? Do you see that as being a possibility?
I think it's a possibility, but not because of a preemptive strike. I think it's a possibility because of an accidental situation where, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, two countries are on the brink of a nuclear war and an accident may trigger it. But I think the accident is possible. In fact, I'm very pessimistic about the future of our society 100 or 200 years from now with our ability to annihilate mankind.
I would like to follow up on Doug's question. In your article that he refers to that you wrote, I believe, in 1974, you indicated that the Soviet Union is becoming more aggressive. There seems to be data to support that in Afghanistan and other parts of Africa. Also, the relationship in Vietnam and the movement into Cambodia that concern the Chinese. With this aggression in mind, do you think it is, forgetting PR in election years, do you think it is a very wise and prudent policy policy of the United States to try to become closer to China, which is a very large nation bordering the Soviet Union, to, as a chess move, as a counter to this aggression by the Soviet Union? Will it discourage the Soviet Union to slow down, seeing that it's moving China towards a friendship with us?
Well, if you accept the fact that the Russians are more aggressive, there certainly is enough evidence to indicate they're very active even in Africa. You probably have to accept the analysis of the Vice Premier, Deng Xiaoping, who basically said that we're going to have to encircle the Soviet Union with Japan, China, Western Europe, and the United States. I buy that as a legitimate chess move to more or less curtail Soviet activities, keeping in mind this may provoke them as well, or panic them out. You've got to play both ends on that. But we're going to have problems in Africa. The Russians are using the Cubans there, the Russians are using the Vietnamese in Cambodia, and they're testing President Carter, much like Khrushchev tested President Kennedy, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think President Carter, over the next year or so, is really going to be tested.
Lou Reed.
I'd like to ask you to probe the psychology of the clandestine operations in the third world countries. Do you think that this is something that happens to the agents themselves as they move in, or do you feel that they are actually instructed to carry out U.S. foreign policy when they are operating in those countries, and as such do tend to support the status quo or right-wing government?
I would say that the agents that we have operating overseas really follow the policies of our government, i.e., to say the CIA, the directors, for a number of reasons. When you're overseas, you are really isolated, and you are dependent on your government. And if you start to double-cross your government, you can be eliminated very easily. If you do things on your own, you can be eliminated very easily, and nobody knows about it. So when you're overseas, you play the game according to the rules, which I didn't. That's why I had problems in Brussels. So I would say that these agents are, in fact, following the policies of our government without question.
Do you feel that the legislation which supposedly curtailed things like assassinations, etc., is actually being implemented? Is it possible for you to tell as an outside observer whether these covert operations are actually restricted, more restricted than they were in Chile?
I would say that they are not more restricted, though the official party line is that they are. It still depends on the President, National Security Advisor, and a secret memorandum that the press and the public still does not know about, which I am told still gives the President these interesting powers during emergency situations. And when you allow the President to define what is an emergency situation, we've lost these controls. Now, the fact that much of these assassinations and the background behind that has been publicized, that is a step in the right direction, because some agents at least can say, wait a minute, we're not supposed to do that. Whereas in the past they were doing this Nuremberg thing while we're following the orders of our superiors.
David Cohen.
Yes, last April, Arkady Shevchenko, a Soviet undersecretary, defected to the United States. And the CIA was the first organization, Secret Intelligence Service, to contact him, or he contacted them. He has been given a plush apartment. He has been given a girlfriend. They gave her $40,000 worth of cars and trips. How far should the United States go? How far should the CIA go in catering to Soviet defectors?
Okay, I'm not going to sponsor the girlfriend routine, but I will say this. I have a feeling that this man probably was very valuable as far as intelligence is concerned, and I feel that he was paid for his services. And my personal feelings are how he used his money is really his own business. And I think this is probably the CIA party line as well. I would go along with that because he was probably paid very handsomely for his services. And the fact that his expenditures were publicized got both this individual and the CIA in trouble. But I do not think the CIA should go the route of setting people up like that, rather than they should just pay the man what he does with the money. It's their business.
The FBI is also interested in that case, and it seems to be a tug-of-war between the CIA and the FBI for his services. Is there much jealousy, professional jealousy, between these two intelligence gathering agencies?
That's an excellent question. You will find, if you ever had a chance to deal with these people on the inside, there is a tremendous amount of animosity, not just competition, animosity. They want to outdo the other agency. In fact, we had situations where I would turn my intelligence information to the CIA, turn it over. 2-3 weeks later, I'd be up at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base dealing with Air Force agents. I'd be laying the cards on the table, what we'd learned. An Air Force agent would ask me, does the CIA know about this? And I'd tell them, well, I just gave this to them 2 weeks ago, and they'd say, damn. The competition is really there. And it's not in our national interest when it reaches that degree, by the way.
Doug Clark.
I'm interested about the money. You're talking about being set up with apartments. How much money is there in spying? Are there the Reggie Jacksons of spies who can negotiate top money, or has the money gone out of the racket?
Based on some contacts I've had, I understand that the real money is not if you are employed directly by the intelligence services, but if you are a wheeler dealer and put yourself in a position where they need you, but you're not employed by them. Then you can negotiate your own fee. Now, you'll find that the Russian intelligence services do not pay very handsomely. Now, you'll find Americans be willing to give away our national security for $2,000 or $3,000. You wonder why they're willing to risk something like that and end up in jail for a lifetime adventure because of that. But the wheeler dealer who is in a position is the guy that can make the money. Typical example, to get some hardware from an East European country, it was budgeted for about $400,000. The actual agent in the European country who handled the hardware to deliver it probably got no more than $10,000 or $15,000 for it. But all the middlemen in between, they got their take. And that's what rolls up the total cost of an operation.
I think you're in an advantageous position to maybe answer this question. We hear a lot of articles that are printed and also movies that are made about double agents. To what extent is that true of the Soviet Union, United States, and other countries where some individuals are playing both sides of the political fence?
I think it's very true. You'll find that with espionage, well, take myself for example. Here I'm dealing with the Russians, and you have to monitor what I am doing. I've taken lie detector tests, of course, but the real point is, because you have contact with the other side, it is possible you can be playing both ends against the middle. It is a very difficult thing to prove. And it is a situation where there were people who were doing that. Some of the greatest double agents who operated, one was named Harold Kim Philby, who was a Russian agent, penetrated British intelligence, the number 2 man in British intelligence. He ended up talking with Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, visiting Washington on and off, and Mr. Philby blew a number of key American operations. And it's rather ironic, but the double agents that penetrated British intelligence, like Philby and McLean, Burgess, and George Blake, all these guys at one time or another were in deep trouble. Some were imprisoned. They all now are in Moscow. They all escaped.
I have to stop here and say once again we're out of time. Peter James, it's been a pleasure having you on the program the last 2 weeks. I know our viewers have enjoyed it immensely.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I also express my appreciation of the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, for the past 2 weeks we've been discussing the CIA and intelligence and spying and foreign policy. I hope you've enjoyed those programs. For the next 2 weeks, we're going to bring you another significant topic. We're going to be dealing with the question of law enforcement and interview the superintendent of the Idaho State Police, and we're going to talk about also other cities such as Los Angeles and the SWAT team and how that operates. I hope you'll join us next week at 6 o'clock. Until then, I am Tony Stewart wishing you a good week.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.